I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. This is the second in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. We are covering the stories in this here book published in 1970. If you want details about how the stories were selected, we covered that very intensely in the first episode on Stanley Weinbaum's Martian Odyssey. So you can go back and see that. I'll be collecting these episodes in a single YouTube playlist. Of course, the audio is available on all podcatchers. But today I have a panel of experts that are going to talk to you about one of the foundational stories of science fiction, not just because it's in here, but we're going to talk about the impact of John W. Campbell and his story, Twilight. So we're going to get a little bit into the history of the dude who wrote it and the issue of the magazine, and then on the story itself. My guest today, I know I said that James on social media that James Reich was going to be here, author James Reich. He was not able to make it at the last moment, but I do want to put a shout out for his Mars novel, A Song My Enemies Sing, which is really incredible. And he has a new book called The Moth for Stars that just came out. So shout out to James and those books. He'll be here later on other episodes of the series. And if you really like, he and I covered Barry Maltzberg's Beyond Apollo on the Dickheads podcast. And that's a really great episode. So I recommend James's point of view there. Joining me today, I have two guests. Kate Heffner is a postgraduate researcher of science fiction and gender studies at the School of History at the University of Kent in England. And she's finishing up back home in Iowa, her postdoctorate. She was awarded the Peter Nichols International Prize for Best Essay in Science Fiction for her research on feminist science fiction fan cultures. So, Kate, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, considering the way we kind of have reevaluated John W. Campbell, I thought you were a perfect person to have on this panel. Also, the man who literally wrote the book on John W. Campbell, Astounding by Alec Nevala-Lee. Alec is a longtime science fiction writer and historian, but I think, and he also just recently wrote a book on Buckminster Fuller. And but obviously, we're having him here today to talk about John W. Campbell. And when we did our series on 30s science fiction, we covered on this podcast, we covered Clifford Mack's Rule 18. So you can hear that. But specifically on that show, Alec said, John W. Campbell is the one I really like to talk about. So I had to. So immediately when I saw this in the table of contents and I knew I wanted to do this series, Alec was bound to be here. So Alec, welcome back to Postcards from a Dying
World. Thanks. As I mentioned earlier, I am delighted to be back here, and I will take any excuse to talk about Campbell's story.
Yeah. Well, and just the dude himself, John W. Campbell, and his importance. So let's start off with that. Let's start off with who John W. Campbell was. One of the most interesting things, like his other, I think the two pillars of his fiction are this and Who Goes There. And I think his backstory of having a mom who was a twin, plays much more of a role in Who Goes There than Twilight. But what can we start with you, Alex? What do you know about John W. Campbell's childhood and how he ended up becoming interested in genre fiction, because I do think that that's a huge part of the story.
Sure. So Campbell was born in 1910, and he was one of the sort of classic cases of a future science fiction writer and editor who felt like an outsider growing up. He felt set apart by his intelligence, which was undeniable. He was socially awkward, like many of these people were, and again, he was not he was privileged, right? He was not coming from the kind of background where he had to face discrimination. He was a white Protestant male, growing up in the 1920s. But he certainly felt like an outcast when he was growing up. And I think, like a lot of people, he found science fiction to be a genre where the qualities that set him apart from his peers were actually advantages, right? The sort of quintessential competent man hero, or at least like the heroic figure of the pulps during this period is like, usually a white male with a background in science who can build things, right, and solve problems. And that's kind of how Campbell saw himself from an early stage. The one thing about him that I think is crucial to understanding his career is that he wanted to be a great inventor. He was someone who had a very high opinion of his own intelligence and skills, at building things. And, like initially that was kind of where he saw himself going. And it's not until he, he had to drop out of college, for various reasons. He was at MIT, dropped out, went to Duke, got his bachelor's degree in physics, but never quite became the inventor he wanted to be. But then when he was given the chance, a bit after the period we're talking about, to run Astounding science fiction, he kind of turned that into an outlet for those ambitions. He said, I'm going to turn science fiction from a pulp genre into this machine for generating ideas, and that I have access to these writers, these fans, and my own talents, to kind of start this conversation about how the future will look, obviously, but also like maybe we'll make a discovery that will actually have an impact on the real world. And that's definitely like something that he wanted and pursued until the day he died.
Well, and we see parts of like his upbringing and his background that affects a lot of these stories, these early stories that were his fiction. I mean, obviously with the Who Goes There and the You Don't Know Who's Real, he had this situation with his mom and his aunt, who were identical twins, who had very different personalities but looked exactly the same, and they would trick him sometimes. And like, for a child, that had to be a really imprinting thing. Now with Twilight, we kind of see like the imprinting of the scientific background and the science thinking from the very beginning, that and we'll get into the story later, but it's just such a far reaching story for the time. And one of the things that we talked about in the first episode of this series with the Martian Odyssey is there was science fiction before that story and there was science fiction after, right? And I think one of the things about Twilight is that you could argue that Who Goes There has a little bit more staying power, but Twilight is a revolutionary story for science fiction. And I think I'm wondering how both of you feel about, now having revisited this, if you agree that, I mean, we know its role is in the Hall of Fame, but when I reread it this time, I just could really feel the revolution and the shaking of the ground in science fiction as you're reading it. Kate, how did you feel reread? Have you read the story before, or was this the first time?
So this was my first time reading the story. One thing that I was kind of drawn to is thinking through what this particular story means in like our particular current historical moment, thinking through automation and the ways that, we have language models that are, building and creating sort of different uses of language and writing. The mechanization, at least for me, I'm gonna connect this to some of Judith Merrill's work. I was on a podcast with you prior.
Yeah.
We had the Judith Merrill podcast episode.
And she's in this book as well. Yeah.
So for me, thinking through Only a Mother, Judith Merrill's short story, which has a lot of like tones of automation, of looking at like a fully mechanized domestic space, within the house, and thinking through sort of like the same sort of science fictional trope of automation and replacing essentially human things in Twilight. So yeah.
It's a really cool and important thing. And the connection, Judith Merrill obviously is like one of the titans of well, and she was a part of the fan community as early as the 30s too, so she was reading this stuff at the time as a Futurian. Now Alec, as far as the revolution, we'll come back, we'll get more seriously into the story later, but just starting off, and we'll get more into Campbell as a person, but the revolution of this story, like, and its importance, like, how do you view it as a person who researched this guy in this era in general?
So we'll talk more about Twilight, obviously, in a little bit. But the two things that I think are interesting about the story, one is the tone, which is, it's kind of elegiac, it's melancholy, it's a little bit, darker and more evocative than, the average pulp story. And the other is the attitude towards technology, right? There's ambivalence, right? That maybe technology, it can be incredible, but it can also cost us things about our humanity that are precious, like the curiosity. And what I find really interesting is that, Campbell is pushing back against sort of a more uncritical view of technology, that's more celebratory, that's saying, look at these amazing things we can do, look at these spaceships, look at, these gadgets that, these stories are filled with. But these are stories that he is also writing, that Campbell is writing at the same time while he's writing Twilight. Okay. One crucial point that I want to make now is that Twilight was published under a pen name, all right, as Don A. Stewart. And I'll kind of maybe later on explain where that name comes from.
That was my next question.
Yeah, so we'll put a pin in that for now. But it's interesting that Campbell writes these stories under his own name, John W. Campbell, that are what are called super science stories, that are these sort of like galactic, sort of universe spanning, pulpy stories with, again, these very stereotypical heroes who deploy entire moons as weapons and commit genocide on a vast scale, it's very, I mean, these stories don't hold up as well, but they were very popular at the time. Like Campbell was one of the two most well-regarded authors during this period based on those stories, which I think have not held up very well. But then at the same time, like literally simultaneously, he is writing under the Don A. Stewart name, much more ambitious work that is questioning these premises, right? And the last thing I'll say that tie it back to his autobiography is that his parents were difficult, right? They're kind of real pieces of work, but you look at his stories, and my theory is that the super science stories were written to please his father, who was an engineer, who was kind of like a hard tech kind of guy, and these are the kinds of stories that he would have liked. And the Don A. Stewart stories come out of his ambivalence toward his mother, who made him question things and, forced him to think in certain ways. I would say that are visible in this like sort of parallel track of the fiction he was writing. So to the extent that Campbell's biography is helpful, in thinking about this stuff, it is true that he is someone where there are these contrasts, they're incredibly, it's hard to explain how some of these stories could have been written by the same person. And while I think there's some other explanations, I think the one you can trace back to his childhood is actually a legitimate reading, that these are two sides of his personality that he had to develop, right. And response to his parents.
Well, and it's fascinating because the Don A. Stewart stories, consistently the ones that are legendary are the ones that really had an impact for the Don A. Stewart stories, and they're the ones that who goes there in Twilight, definitely, for example, like, are stories that hold up pretty well, considering, I mean, they have little things here and there, but the Don A. Stewart stories, and look, this is not a thing that's original just to Campbell. Look at Richard Bachman and Stephen King. Stephen King always says that Richard Bachman writes differently than Stephen King does. And speaking as somebody who just just finished writing a novel where I was trying to write with the Philip K. Dick formula and trying to kind of mimic his voice, I'd never done that before. I'd never ever written anything at that length that I wasn't trying to write as myself, right? And so I can understand that Don A. Stewart was a different personality to him and a different voice. And but what do you guys think is like the main factors that really make a difference between like Campbell and Stewart? I mean, I guess this is more Alec. This is more your expertise that we're leaning on here.
Yeah, so I will, kind of, add one thing to that, which is that, I have a copy of a book called The Best of John W. Campbell, which was another anthology I read, and it's
Yeah,
it's almost all Stewart stories. All right, so you look at the table of contents, and the only story that he published under his own name is the first one called The Last Evolution, which is a pretty good story, but every other story is a Donnie Stewart story. So even he knew that these were the stories that would endure. So the obvious factor here, all right, is his wife. All right. So Campbell married in 1931. And at that point, he'd already been writing stories for years. He'd been writing stories since he was an MIT
same year
undergraduate.
he washed out at MIT, right?
Yes.
That he got married.
Yeah. So he'd already established himself as a writer under the Campbell name at that point. All right. And he marries Donia Stewart. All right. Or at least that's the name that she went by. Okay. So clearly Don A. Stewart at minimum is a tribute to his wife. Okay. Who, I mean, I could talk about her for hours. She was clearly an exceptional person. All right. And we know that she typed his stories, that she was kind of his sounding board for ideas, that he would bounce premises off her and she would give him feedback, definitely gave him feedback on drafts. That is established beyond any doubt. What I find interesting to contemplate is, did that collaboration go beyond that? Did
Right.
she? I don't think it wouldn't be accurate to say that she wrote the stories, but one parallel is Robert Heinlein and his first wife, or well, actually second wife, but his wife at the time, Leslyn, was a similar figure, and we actually know a bit more about them. The way they would sort of talk out plots and stories together at home before he wrote them. And as he points out, he did all the writing. Heinlein did all the writing, but he credits Leslyn almost as a co-author, right? And I do think that something similar is going on here. Like the sort of the timing is very suggestive, right? That these stories start to come out of Campbell after his marriage. And at the very least, I would say that I doubt that Donia found those super science stories especially interesting. When she became kind of his first reader, I think it inclined him for these stories to go in a certain direction. And he was still writing the super science stories. It's not a question of him evolving beyond the old mode. He's engaging in both modes simultaneously. But because of Donia, and also because of F. Orland Tremaine, his editor at Astounding, it's the Stewart stories that get published and that sort of get an audience. Okay. So there is this very interesting confluence of factors where Campbell, has a reader and an editor who are both encouraging him to go in these directions.
Well, and she played a role in the managing of the magazine once he became editor, right? She was very, very involved, right?
Yes. So this is also interesting. So I think we're going to be talking mostly about Campbell as a writer, right? But then later on, he becomes editor of Astounding. And we absolutely know that in the early days, Donia was his slush pile reader. She talks about reading tons of stories until her eyes are, falling out of her head, most of which are terrible. But she was kind of his uncredited assistant, at least in the early days. And I think remained, up to a certain point, an important force at the magazine. I'll just kind of digress for 1 second to share my favorite story from Astounding, which is after Pearl Harbor, Heinlein was trying to convince Campbell to sign up. And Campbell was reluctant because he says, I don't want to leave this magazine behind. And Heinlein essentially says, well, I think Donia and Leslyn could do as good a job or better as you could running the magazine in your absence, which it didn't actually happen. But to me, it speaks volumes about the roles they played in their husbands' careers and kind of the impact they must have had that is kind of invisible, but if you look, closely enough at the letters and sort of people's memories of that time, it's undeniable that, she played a big role.
Right. And that brings me to Kate. And Kate, you and I are going to talk more in the back half of this episode because we're getting Alec's expertise. But the thing about this part is the role that women played from the beginning in the science fiction community. And you had a couple. You had Judith Merrill, who was very vocal, and you had a couple that were out front. Judith Merrill obviously eventually challenged Campbell and said, like, you're going to publish my stories, right? We'll come back to that on her episode. But what is it you think this relationship that Campbell says about how women were a part of the community at the time?
Yeah, so that's a really tricky and thorny question, thinking through that, because not only in this particular issue of Astounding, we have Donna Stewart, but we also have the third of the Skylark stories, if I am remembering correctly. I'm going to pull this up just. Yeah, and thinking through like the sort of hidden hands and editorial work that a lot of women did. And they were not only, they were never really seen as contributors or writers or fans, a lot of times in their own sort of, in their own right. So right now we're looking at the Astounding Stories, the November 1934 issue. And in this particular issue, you have the Skylark of Valerian, which is part 4 of the Skylark series, right? And Edward E. Smith also had, he worked with one of his friend's wife on that particular story to kind of like dress it up in a certain way. And it's the combination of both romance aspects of the romance genre, Western aspects of the Western genre, and sort of creating a new type of science fiction story, dare I use Gernsback's language. So thinking through this, there are a lot of women who, adopted pen names, and who, wrote in with masculine pen names, like, prior to some of the 1970s science fiction feminist movements. So it's a really thorny and tricky piece of science fiction history. I know that there's work by Justine Lara-Balestier, who wrote Battle of the Sexes in Science Fiction, and Davin, Partners in Wonder, who've gone through and looked at the recovery work of women, especially in this period. Professor Lisa Yazik as well. So it's interesting to think through the ways that like they're the help of a wife in the creation of science fiction, because I'm thinking through the ways in which that could be sort of negative with John Campbell, like, and I'll refer to you folks on that, like, later on, when he kind of loses his tracks. Yeah.
Well, and we're about to get into the issue, but also, I mean, even when one of my favorite stories about that is how even though Lovecraft wrote to Kuttner and introduced C.L. Moore as Kathy Moore, he still, like, Kuttner still, his first letter back said Mr. Moore at the top of the letter, even though in the letter it clearly said Kathy Moore. So, which is funny, because when your whole marriage was started by a letter from H.P. Lovecraft, it's just an interesting thing there too. But I find fascinating. This hidden hand is totally fascinating, a part of this era, because that plays a role too. Is far back. I mean, Philip K. Dick also has that situation when a lot of his best masterpieces happened during his marriage to Anne. And even though he wrote really good work along all the divorces and marriages and everything, Man in the High Castle, Martian Time Slip, a lot of those really good books got first reading by Anne Dick. So, like, that carries on for a long time. And vice versa too. I'm sure, like, C.L. Moore, I'm sure, got a lot of help from Henry Kuttner, just by the osmosis of being together and being around each other. So, but yeah, let's move on to the issue. Let's get into, I'll share for those of you watching on YouTube. If you're listening audio, it's fine, but this is the time where we're going to be looking at the actual issue here. And let's look at the table of contents first, and I'll try to zoom it in a little bit.
I do love this show and tell aspect of it. Like, all right, folks, how many of you have seen like a pulp magazine, like have touched it, can smell it, like feel all the gnarly bits of it? So
yeah. And there's some really interesting stuff in this issue. So let's talk first about, this was 89 years ago, which is a long time. Almost 9 decades ago. This was the November 1934 issue. And so that means next November will be the 90th anniversary of this story. So I don't know, maybe we got to celebrate in November. This was the same month that Winston Churchill first gave a speech warning that Germany was rearming, quote, secretly, illegally, and rapidly. A team of American baseball stars, including Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, arrived in Japan to play a tour of exhibition games. That's a pretty big sign of how long ago it was. And retired U.S. Marine Corps officer Smedley Butler caused an uproar when he gave a testimony to the House of Representatives on the Un-America activities. Many of you will recognize that story from Rachel Maddow's new current podcast. I think it's called Prequel. Well, it's about the first attempt at a fascist overthrow of the United States, which, eventually Sinclair Lewis would write about in It Can Happen Here, right? Which was a classic of that era, which at the time was speculative fiction, but of course now becomes alternate history if you read it now. But 1934, interesting stuff. So, Alex, starting with you, and then Kate, what are your thoughts looking at this table of contents? Alec, I know you got lots of thoughts when we do this part of the show. I enjoy listening to you talk about.
Oh, good. Well, here I go. So the one thing I want to mention is that this is a Tremaine issue. Okay, so F. Orland Tremaine was the editor of Astounding at this point, and he's actually the second editor. So it was founded by a guy named Harry Bates, and then Tremaine, and then Campbell takes over. The Harry Bates era is not that great. I mean, Isaac Asimov famously said there's not a single story that whole run that is worth remembering. But Tremaine is underrated. Okay, he did great things for Astounding. He kind of like laid the groundwork for Campbell. Campbell clearly deserves credit for inaugurating like the golden age, but he was building on what Tremaine had already done. Okay, Tremaine was not necessarily a science fiction fan, but he was a professional. He was a good editor. He understood how to build a magazine, and so he goes after authors like Campbell and Doc Smith. He builds sort of this community of readers in the letters column. And he does like really interesting stuff. Like he publishes, I would say, this is, I can't remember if this is before or after this issue, but he publishes At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft, which is probably the only story from that period that most casual fans will have read. He publishes stuff like Low by Charles Fort, which is actually serialized in this issue, which is a really interesting, weird book that, again, it's like, I mean, I think about this sometimes. It's like, what would it be like to be a reader going to a newsstand, 1934, and I forget what the cover price was, but 10 cents or or 20 cents, right? So for 20 cents, you can buy this issue, and it has Twilight by Donna Stewart, which is a very important story. It's got a ton of material from Charles Fort's Low. I mean, it's a great deal. It's so mind-blowing to me that you could just like kind of wander into a drugstore and buy this magazine.
20 cents.
And I think a lot of
20 cents, it says at the bottom there, with a $2
right.
yearly subscription.
$2 a year, right? And by the time Tremaine was editor, a lot of that stuff had been established. So I guess my one big takeaway with the issue here is that Tremaine sometimes gets dropped from the history of science fiction, but he's someone who deserves a lot of credit for what he did with this magazine.
Yeah, just for buying at the Mountains of Madness too, because that was actually rejected by Weird Tales already.
Yeah, and he famously, I think it's cut a bit. It's like not the full version of that story. And so I think Lovecraft purists would say, oh, he should have published the full thing, but it's still stunning, right? It's an incredible story. Clearly influenced Who Goes There. I think he published the other one is The Shot Out of Time. And again, these are fantastic stories that have held up. Regardless of your thoughts about Lovecraft himself, putting them out there in the early 30s was a big deal.
Okay, so Kate, what are your thoughts looking at this awesome table of contents? You already mentioned E.E. Smith a little bit, which was on my list of things to talk about when I get there. But what are your thoughts on this issue?
So I guess thank you so much for laying out all the groundwork before. So now I can go in and just talk about sort of the weird things with the title page or with the table of contents. Thinking through the history of science and the history of science and technology studies, sociology of science, and using that sort of lens to look at this table of contents, you see, some really interesting folks who are contributing to a dialogue about science. So you have Fort, thinking through the fan clubs of the 14 fan clubs and folks that were interested in some of the mythos of Charles Fort, and having Lowe again, as he said, prior, thinking through that sort of material on science and spirituality. Also thinking through how this issue is 5 years before the 1939 World's Fair in New York and the first Science Fiction World Convention, but thinking through how mechanization, automation, and machinery is already such a giant sort of prophecy or precursor to what will come forward. I guess I will say that I don't see any women listed in the table of contents, which is a duh there. I mean, I don't know. That's obvious, in looking through that. So I'd be interested to know, learn more about Tremaine's relationship with women authors at the time, and maybe that's something that Alec can speak on.
That's a great question. If you give me a minute, I can look into it. I have a bunch of notes about this era.
Alec,
I don't know.
You do that. I'll talk about some of the other authors.
Okay, I don't know the answer offhand, but that's a great question.
Yeah. So this thought variant novel, The Mole Pirate, is by Murray Leinster, who is I have one of his books here, The Forgotten Planet. Murray Leinster is a very important figure in 30s science fiction, but was active throughout his life, long into the 60s. And if you are one of those people who's constantly looking through used bookstore shelves for science fiction, you're going to see a lot of Murray Leinster out there, because he was very popular back in the day. And so I kind of thumbed through this story a little bit, but I didn't read it. But his The Forgotten Planet is kind of the classic work that it has to do with giant insects and a colony world. And I read it back in the day. It's very good. Other stuff that appears in here, I don't know Nat Schrader, or is it Schrader? Don't know him. But The Lost Planet by Frank Belknap Long. Frank Belknap Long Jr. was a Lovecraftian mythos writer, one of the early acolytes of Lovecraft, when he was still alive, and continued to write mythos fiction long after Lovecraft was gone. But he's an important figure in mythos fiction. We talked a lot about him in the podcast on At the Mountains of Madness during my 1930s science fiction series, which this episode will be linked on that list as well. But in the At the Mountains of Madness episode, we talked a lot about Frank Belknap Long, because he also had a story in the same issue as the first part of the serial for At the Mountains of Madness. The Machine from Ganymede there by Raymond Z. Gallon. I admit, I was not familiar with him, but a couple weeks ago I got this book at Bart's Books in Ojai, California. And I saw that according to the back of this book that he was a mainstay of 1920 science fiction. So, but he wrote well into the 70s, and I cannot say I know his work, but I am going to be learning it soon because I got this book. And of course, Kate brought up E.E. Smith, who was the most popular science fiction author of the 20s and 30s. Pretty much his Lensman series was extremely well known. And then I have something to comment on from the letter section. Unless, Alec, did you have something? Did you find anything on Tremaine?
Yeah, so just a quick cursory look at my notes. So Tremaine did publish Catherine Moore. I see two stories just like skimming through these first couple of years, and he refers to her as let's see, where is it? She is an outstanding author of the weird story. And it's unclear to me. It may have been published as C.L. Moore. All right, so it's unclear to me how many people would have known that she was a woman. And she's the exception, right? Like I'm just kind of skimming through my notes on these issues. You're right. I don't see a lot of women's names here.
Yeah, and C.L. Moore, we should clarify. She did not use C.L. Moore to hide her gender. She did it to hide the fact that she was moonlighting during the Depression, because during the Depression, a lot of people would say, if you have another job, well, then you don't need this one, and then you would a lot of times get fired from jobs if you were caught moonlighting. So she was very worried about that. And by the way, she's from Indiana, and I had the experience. I went to the hotel that now exists in the building that housed her insurance agency, and the mail slot where she dropped her submissions in the mail is still on the wall in the lobby of the hotel. So if you ever go to Indianapolis, you can go and visit the mail slot that Catherine Moore used to send her stories to Weird Stories. So Weird Tales.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
One last thing, I did see something in my notes, a letter from a reader who says that he thinks that H.P. Lovecraft's turn to science fiction will be as great as C.L. Moore's. All right, so I think it's a indication of the she was popular. She was someone that people respected and looked forward to reading her stuff.
Oh, and two last things I want to add about Murray Leinster and E.E. Smith. E.E. Smith was a food engineer who specialized in mass producing donuts, which is really weird and interesting. And Murray Leinster created the rear projection for special effects. So two inventors, which is really weird and cool. All right, before we get into
just a quick note, if you read my book Astounding, there is some good stuff about Will Jenkins, the guy who wrote as Murray Leinster, inventing cool stuff during World War II.
Right. Now, one thing I do want to point out from the letters, which you always have to read when you look at these, because the Twitter or the internet discourse of the time. Here. All right. There is a really important letter in this issue. Did you guys happen to check that out? It's okay if you didn't, but
I would have at one point. I don't think I know which one you're referring to, but maybe you'll tell me.
Yeah, let me see if well, there's a great ad. Let's see. There is a letter in here from one Mr. Don Wollheim.
Yes, that's right. I do have a note about this.
Right there, yeah. So Don Wollheim wrote in a letter suggesting that you should create a separate magazine for adventure stories, which is a really interesting thing that he wrote a letter about that for this issue.
Actually, I'm looking at the image on the screen here, and I do see a lot of names like Bob Tucker. These are people. Tucker, also became a writer, but like these names persist over time. I don't think anyone would have realized that Wollheim was going to play as big a role in the history of science fiction that he did. Based on his profile in the fan community at this point. He was known as kind of a troll, like a troublemaker.
Right.
And it's not till later on that he kind of becomes a more mainstream figure.
Yeah, and the fact that Tucker is already starting his letter hacking, antics in this is kind of cute and hilarious. Can I mention one thing really briefly?
Oh no, do go.
Is that one of the things I've found really interesting about this issue, like beyond the publications of the short stories, is that Tremaine addresses the readers. So the editorial of which is responding to like the letters, like how much like the pulp is magazine is flourishing and what have you, which often mirrors the style of Gernsback in his editorials, where things are going great, what have you, but also in the editorial, Tremaine kind of addresses the reader like as a family. So it's interesting to think through how Tremaine's already building this as like more of like a family magazine to get people interested in it, rather than something that is just like a singular reader within a household. It's there's this attempt to build a more familial community based around this pulp magazine, which
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I hadn't read his editorials in this issue, so that is a very good point to bring up. Okay, so now the story Twilight, coming after an ad to stop constipation on the previous page. And the ads in these magazines are hilarious. Look, and I'm not picking on people from the 30s, because if you look at ads from the 80s, they're just as funny. And I'm sure people looking at ads from our era in the future will laugh too. But Twilight, so a story.
Well, can I just break in one really insidery thing that I like to mention is that at this point, all the ads were sold for all of Street and Smith's magazines as a whole. They were not targeted at particular readers. Okay.
Yeah.
And Campbell, I don't know about Tremaine, but Campbell hated the ads. They were kind of forced on him. And yeah, it's like these like hemorrhoid creams and like things that he did not think were necessarily suited to his readership. And it's not until I want to say the late 40s that he finally is able to get ads directed toward science fiction fans. And that's a big change. And it definitely plays a part in building the market for novels in hardcover, for anthologies, for a lot of things.
Yeah. And look, I'm sure there are science fiction readers who had constipation issues, so somebody's got to use those ads. So, all right, Twilight, the story. This awesome artwork. I don't think I noted who did the artwork, but
I think it's Elliot Dold, if I recall correctly. I think it's actually down there in the caption.
Yeah, I blew it up a little bit. Oh yeah, there it is. Elliot Dold. Then I saw The City of Perfect Machines. All right, and so the subtitle, a story that will set you to dreaming of purple distances, of a far off world wherein a race is dying 7 million years away. 7 million years. You got to say it like that, I think, at this point. Yes, I've read this story before. I had that Best of John W. Campbell anthology collection that you showed earlier, which I got because of Who Goes There, because I was a fan of the John Carpenter movie when I was a kid. I don't know what happened to that. I lost that book somewhere along the way, or maybe traded it for something, but I do remember reading this story. However, I read it so long ago that I had a real emotional impact to reading it this time. And the other thing I did is I put on a reading of it, an audiobook reading of it, and followed along with the words on the page, which I don't usually do, but I was trying to get kind of a different experience. And then it was kind of interesting way to read it. But my feeling on this story is, my God, is it so intensely idea driven for 1934. I don't necessarily like the hitchhiker setup, because I don't think it really serves much of a purpose. But I'll just give a quick synopsis. If you listen to this episode and you haven't read the story, you really should do that. And it's free. It's in the Internet Archive, so there's no excuse not to find it and read it. The story sets up with on December 9th, 1932, Jim Bendall, a real estate agent, is driving along and he picks up Aries and Kenlin, I believe it's pronounced. And he has this wild story of time traveling and that he has returned from the future. Apparently his TARDIS was off too. That happens when you're time traveling. You're shooting for millions of years. You're going to end up, maybe in 1932. Give or take a millennia or two. But 7 million year trip. Campbell has mentioned that he was inspired by an H.G. Wells, I believe, essay about somebody traveling far to the future. And he goes to this far-flung future and he finds that the human race is gone and that the machines are have taken over and they're doing their own thing. And it's this, kind of trip to the future to see these things. I don't think you need to know more before we start the discussion. Starting with Alec, what place, as a Campbell expert, what place does Twilight you think hold in his lexicon? Because I think it's his best story, hands down. Who Goes There has the most impact, but I think Twilight is the best John W. Campbell fiction. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, I mean, I would rank it like a bit below Who Goes There. I think that's my favorite Campbell story. But it clearly is a major story, not just for the genre, but also for Campbell. And it kind of comes out of nowhere. Like you look at the stuff he was writing before this, and there's a story, The Last Evolution, which kind of, has similar themes. And there's a story called The Black Star Passes that has a few sections that are kind of similar in tone. But otherwise, like this kind of comes out of nowhere. Right. And I think a lot of the credit goes to Donia. Another story that he cites as an influence is a novel called The Red God's Call by a guy named C.E. Scoggins, which so I actually have not read that entire novel, but I've read the first chapter, which is what Campbell cites as an influence. And it is actually very striking. If you're a Twilight fan, I would recommend reading that chapter because the tone is very similar. I think it kind of awoke, something in Campbell to the possibilities of this melancholy tone. And there are also like some interesting parallels to the story. Red God's Call starts with basically someone picking up a hitchhiker who is more than he seems. He's sort of physically impressive and intelligent, and he sings a song that makes the person feel things that he hasn't felt in a long time. And he describes in the Scoggins story going to Guatemala and seeing ruins there that are described in ways that I think you can hear the influence, in Campbell's description of these cities. So again, like, it's interesting, right? Like that story, I think he read that story was like, I can do something similar. I can do something similar in science fiction. And you could say the tone, as you say, H.G. Wells, I think, did similar things in The Time Machine, this idea of a dying world and the kind of like the melancholy at the awareness that things are going to change and that mankind, might be diminished, by in the far future. But again, you look at the other stories that are being published at this time, other stories in the same issue of this magazine, and it is very different. And you can really see why it made such a big impact on readers at the time.
Yeah, and science fiction is filled with, science fiction writers taking works of mainstream literature and using their my favorite example, my favorite science fiction novel of all time, Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner, which is, a retelling or using the stylistic method of Don Passos' American trilogy. You could take these like mainstream works of, sci-fi. It's crazy to hear that sounds really directly influencing this piece of work. Kate, you said that this was your first time reading this. So, considering that, Campbell has a pretty gnarly reputation, especially, for but a lot of younger science fiction fans, the first time they've heard of John Campbell was, a speech, just, absolutely roasting him. It is curious for me because I read John Campbell John W. Campbell for the first time before his reputation kind of went south. So I'm interested to know how it's different, for a younger science fiction reader who comes to it from that perspective. It's got to be a totally different perspective than we had when we first, read Campbell. So what was your experience with this? Like your feeling like when you went into it?
Yeah. So obviously like John Campbell, I'm not a John Campbell biographer. That's Alec has done that sort of critical, in-depth work. So I feel a little bit weird. I'm walking a fine rope here to say what I want to say, but thinking through the legacies of Campbell, beginning like with in 1988 when Samuel Delaney talked about discrimination within the science fiction field of publishing. Thinking through the renaming of the John Campbell Award, and folks who have done a lot of bibliographic and historical work on looking at the writing of science fiction and science fictionality from diverse and inclusive perspectives. So there's a lot there. I will also say like the George R. Martin conundrum a few years ago with what was it at Worldcon where he spoke about Gernsback and all of these other folks and that sort of people taking him to task and critically engaging with that rhetoric. So coming into this again, like born and bred feminist and reading through some of these works like Asimov, which is a whole nother can of worms in a certain way. Yeah.
Well, no, and Kate, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted your opinion is because I didn't want it to just be, those of us, because I do think it makes a difference coming from a time before Campbell like was written about, you know what I'm saying? Like he was just another name in a table of contents for me in the beginning, right? So, but whereas I think where you're coming from is a younger researcher in this is that, you're not coming at it with that. You're coming at it with, the discrimination things that were a part of the community. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think Alex, about that as well. Like otherwise you wouldn't have decided to go and write, like get in and do all that really sometimes yucky, terrible biographical work of having to go through the archives and read through like, some just ridiculous and hurtful and weird things and just, yeah, in a way, doing archival work in order to kill your idols. Like, wow, I can't believe Campbell said this. I can't believe, yeah. So I think approaching this, I try to approach it from a very clear not a biased perspective. Like I went into this thinking, okay, give it a shot, see what the language, prose style and, themes. And I was kind of surprised, like in reading through this and thinking through the sort of softness within the story in certain areas. Again, like looking at like technocratic innovations of the marvelous machine. Marvelous is repeated over and over and over again, sort of like an automatic form of describing the mechanization and technology like within this world. So that's a lot of random thoughts, but yeah, that was my sort of shock and like, yeah.
Well, and for me too, I think this particular reading of Twilight, I did have that baggage in my head. I also had the experience of reading Alec's book twice. Well, I didn't have a highlighter the first time I read it, so I had to go back and highlight my the light highlights that you can see in there. So I had to read it twice, But the funny thing is having like learned the history of Campbell, it definitely gave me a different color reading it. But I will say for me, I went into this saying there's no way I'm going to think this is a better story than Who Goes There. I kept thinking like, Who Goes There should be the one that should be in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, even though it's more of a horror story as well. I kept thinking that's the one that should be in the Hall of Fame. And then I came out of it saying, no, it's the one that deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. And I'm wondering how you guys feel about that, because I think it needs to be in the Hall of Fame just because of its revolutionary impact, because of how far into the future it goes. Because, yeah, Time Machine did that, but it was a little more surreal. And this story is a little more hard science fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I will note that there are other volumes in this series, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, that cover novellas, longer works, and Who Goes There does appear there, I believe. This is mostly short stories, so maybe it got disqualified because of length. But it's interesting, right? Because like Who Goes There is vastly more famous. Again, like because of the thing, it's I would say 100 times more read than Twilight. And probably 1,000 times more read than any other, Campbell story. But Twilight, it's funny now because like we are accustomed to this kind of story. I think there's a huge line of science fiction stories that kind of come out of this tone and these themes that Campbell, kind of introduces into the pulps at least. But at the time, not everyone liked it. Isaac Asimov didn't like it. He talks about in his memoirs about how he read the story by Don A. Stewart. He didn't know who this was, and he was a Campbell fan, right? And so he didn't make the connection between their names until he actually went to meet Campbell. And at that first meeting, he realized that Campbell was Don A. Stewart, who had written Twilight and some other fiction that he wasn't fond of. So if you're like a young fan during this period, maybe you do want these like big planet destroying super science stories. That's kind of what you're used to reading, and that this story Twilight is kind of an outlier. It's very different from what you're used to, and it takes time for readers as a whole to kind of come around to the way the genre is changing. Okay, but clearly like it's an incredibly productive line of fiction, right, to question technology's impact on individuals, on societies, and the fact that it comes from Campbell is fascinating, because he's not someone you think of necessarily as being a person who is questioning these things. He is very much, at least in the kind of capsule version of his career, seen as someone who was a technologist, someone who championed the problem-solving side of fiction, of science fiction. But clearly in this story and some other stories, he's questioning it, in ways that will be as influential and maybe more important, in a lot of ways than the stories that we tend to associate with his name.
Right. Well, and I think with this series, the stories were voted upon in an era when that discrimination and sexism was still a part of the community. And I think if we, especially in light of Professor Yazik's like Futures Female books, for one thing, we've got a lot more stories that if we were to look back now and try to develop our Hall of Fame, like I can't believe, as somebody who has recently done a whole podcast series on the 30s and looked really closely at 30s science fiction, that C.L. Moore's Shambleau is not in there. Now, you could easily look at that story and say it's a horror story, but it's science fiction as well. And yes, it has a vampire in it, but I think like Shambleau is as mind-blowing a story from this era as these two stories from the 30s. At the same time, Mountains of Madness is a novella, but Lovecraft probably has stories in there that Color Out of Space, for example, could easily be in here. But the science fiction the science fiction writers that were voting on this, a lot of them, had their favorites, and it comes down to voting less so than the actual achievement. And I do think Twilight has both, where you had some of the people who were voted because Campbell gave them careers, but you also have a story that just really did something nobody had done before, which I think you could argue that there's the Wells speech and there's the time machine, but the way he did a hard science fiction version of 7 million years in the future, and well, I wasn't a big fan of the framing device. It adds a certain literary flair to it. So,
And I will also add, the fact that it appeared in a magazine is a big deal, right? Like,
Yeah.
you could say that Wells was doing this stuff, long before Campbell did, but the idea that this had a place in pulp science fiction in this particular market, was a big deal.
All right. Well, we've already been going for an hour, so I want to start kind of wrapping up. But I know, there's we have a lot to say these days about Campbell and his impact, and obviously I would point people to your book, Astounding, by Alec Nevala-Lee, which has a history not just of John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, but also L. Ron Hubbard and some fun stuff. A lot of people probably thought that L. Ron Hubbard would be your favorite to write about, or Asimov, who you're deeply kind of connected to, but Campbell was the one that you most enjoyed reading and researching about. What was it about Campbell that made him so interesting for you, Alec? Because, considering how controversial he is now, it's kind of a funny position for, I know that puts you in a weird position, right?
Well, it's a position that I kind of have made for myself, because Campbell, it's hard to recall this. So Astounding came out in 2018, right? And at the time, Campbell was unexplored territory. There'd not been a biography of him, right? And that's one reason I chose him over Asimov and Hubbard and Heinlein, because, if you want to read a 2-volume Heinlein biography, there is one, right? There's tons of stuff about Hubbard out there, that's very good. And Campbell, had never really been considered in like this form before, where someone like just went through his whole life and talked about his influence and his personal life, which is fascinating. So, he was available, right? And he was clearly a major subject. It was clearly a fantastic subject for this kind of book. But it's funny, like Campbell, to me, I clearly have very complicated feelings about him. To me, he is a case study. To me, he is an incredible case study. And I think people often assume that you must like someone to devote years of your life to writing a book about them. I don't think that's necessarily true. You have to find them interesting, right? And Campbell, to me, is so interesting because there are things that he did that I admire enormously. I do think he was a genius in certain ways. I do think that, he did things that no one else could have done, and that his influence on science fiction is huge. But also, like it's unclear to me whether science fiction is better because he was there when he was. It's different. There's a famous line in The Power Broker by Robert Caro where he says, you can't say that New York City would be a better city without Robert Moses, but it'd be a different city. And that's kind of how I feel about Campbell. It'd be a different city if he had never existed.
Well, look, and I feel for you because I'm the same way with PKD. Like, I'm straight edge. So like the idea of some of my friends are like, the guy who did all those drugs is the one that you're interested in. But for me, it's a case study. It's like it's this weirdo dude who barely finished high school in Berkeley, who's a direct opposite of his senior classmate, Le Guin, who was Harvard educated. And they both got nominated for the Hugo Award in 1974. And their two life stories couldn't be more different. Is one of the most fascinating things for me to see. It's the case study. So I see that with Campbell. I totally relate to you on that.
And Twilight's a good place to start because it illustrates his good qualities. I think there's incredible talent there that certainly by the end of his life had been misdirected. I think it's like maybe the mildest way of putting it, but it's not a tragedy. It's not interesting if you don't acknowledge the other part of that story, like the strengths that were there and the intelligence that was there, that, got turned into directions that I think were unfortunate. But that were kind of implicit in the positive stuff at the beginning, right? Yeah. And I think you have to look at the whole story to kind of see, the pattern that it makes.
Well, and I know you've mentioned to me before in different contexts of where we're talking, and I've read your book, so I know his wife's influence, but it was really fascinating. I think part of the discussion is Donna's role in Campbell, because I think her hidden hand in all this, especially the fact that she was reading Slush Pile in the 30s. Like, think about how much of science fiction is formed by the fact that she was like kind of this hand, and this happens throughout. Gene Roddenberry gets all the credit for Star Trek, but who invented the Federation is DC Fontana. A lot of the ins and outs of Vulcan culture, DC Fontana, and she never forgave him because, especially on TNG, she and David Gerald played a huge role in developing TNG, and they got cut out by his lawyer, and she never forgave him for that. And it's an interesting position for Donna Stewart, or Donna, his wife, because she played such a role in finding out a lot of these authors. How many of these authors were ones where she read a story and plopped it on his desk and said, buy this story, or talk to this Isaac Asimov kid when he comes in. Story's not ready, but you can talk to him when he leaves his candy shop.
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately, a lot of that stuff
we'll never know.
We'll never know because I use letters, right? Letters are my major source, and obviously Campbell was not writing letters to Donia when they were married, and so there was a huge missing piece there that I really hope someone is able to fill in one day.
Right. Maybe with a time machine and a listening device. But Kate, your thoughts on overall on this experience of and you're a researcher, so I'm sure you didn't just read this story. I'm sure you did a lot of research around it. How did this experience of reading Twilight affect you?
Yeah, I think just in terms of thinking through the division between author and text. I don't want to go into critical, waxing poetical about crit theory and late crit and all that other sort of stuff about death of the author and the text as own individual. I'm going to skip all of that, but I think reading through this story and thinking through the biographical aspects of Campbell's life is really fascinating, and also thinking through that hidden hand aspect of did the wife mirror or engage in the sort of racism and anti-Semitism and what have you, or was there pushback? And I think that there are larger conversations about that that's really interesting to research. I will say that Andre Carrington, his work on speculative Blackness, looks at science fiction fan cultures in the 1930s. The first chapter looks at science fiction fan cultures, the 1930s and the 1950s, and talks a little bit about, the racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism within these cultures, within science fiction fan cultures. So just thinking through the sort of space that, Campbell and others were in, and I find it all super fascinating, and I could talk about it for another hour. So I'm going to cut myself off right now.
Yeah. Well, no, and I appreciate it. And the fact of the matter is that we know eventually, for example, that Judith Merrill pushed back, and that there was, one of the reasons why Wollheim was never he was considered a troll, but one of the reasons he was considered a troll is that he was also politically active for the 30s and already didn't like Campbell's politics. he wasn't one that was going hanging around Campbell's office because he thought he didn't like him, then he didn't like his politics, right? And we're learning more about that now. Just that the we've learned that more about Wilhelm and cross-dressing and how he was like hiding a bit of who he was and lashing out at the people around him too, because he was trying, living this hidden life. And so there's all kinds of interesting things about like these people from this era that it's funny, because some people who think that there wasn't radical thoughts or things going on, or that the community wasn't having the same kind of squabbles as we're having now, they were. It's just happening slower because it was happening in the letter section, the back of magazines. And
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Sorry,
Yeah.
But thinking through hard SF, hard science fiction, golden age, all of these other, sort of like big, massive terms that represent, very different historical iterations of media, like hard SF, all of that is very much a node to John Campbell. So we can't necessarily throw the baby out in the bathwater. Like there are ways that we have to engage with this, even though it feels yucky and gross. And again, thank you, Alec, for doing like all that good scholarly gross work that makes you want to shower after being in the archives.
Yeah, no, there's plenty of that. But no, thank you. I appreciate that. And I do think that the conversation around Campbell is actually just getting started. I think there's a lot of stuff there that we haven't even talked about, not just here, but like as a community, that I think is worth, getting at one of these days.
Yeah. And the cool thing is that, and we as three researchers, I want to put a shout out there to the archivists, because this era, everything happened in archives. And now also, young writers, keep all your files, because the digital archives of the future is going to be the things that the future historians are going to be digging through. And for example, for horror writers, they have the at University of Pittsburgh, Pitt wants to be the home for horror archives in the future. They're building themselves as that for a reason. But these archives, the John W. Campbell papers, as Alec can tell you, are all over the place. Just like the PKD papers, mostly at Fullerton, but some at Riverside, some locked behind their state's lawyers' office doors, unfortunately. But the archives are out there, and you can find this stuff. And for researchers who really want to dig into these things, the letters are fascinating, and it's really fun to dig through the archives, and it gets you out of the house too. So
yeah, I mean, whenever I talk about any of this stuff, I'm always like, please write more biographies. I think the lack of really great science fiction biographies is a huge problem, and especially now that a lot of the people you would interview are gone or on their way out. And you have to fall back on these archives, but there are incredible stories there that someone somewhere needs to work on.
Yeah, and I will put a shout out. I'm not the one to do this because I'm not a giant Dune nerd. But for example, just if anyone's listening out there and you're a huge Dune nerd, Fullerton has all of the straight out of the typewriter drafts, first drafts of Frank Herbert's Dune, right? And they're filled with red pens and giant sections that are cut out, and no one's written about it. And I've seen it. I've been there. I've had that thing in my hand. And when I saw how much was cut out, I said to myself, I'm not the person to write this, but somebody could do a book about the lost Dune, because there are entire sections of Duncan, Idaho that were too cheesy to make it to the book, but it's fascinating when you look at it. And these are things that we have access to because everything was done in hard copy, right? And they weren't going back on a word processor and immediately deleting. So he was red penning this stuff, and it's out there. So, that's my last shout out on that. All right. So, Kate and Alec, this was great. I love talking about John W. Campbell. I do think he is a fascinating and interesting character. I think, Alec, your book is awesome. I read it twice for a reason. Kate, I am very much looking forward to your work and finding out more about what you did for your postdoc, which you're wrapping up. How can people find you, Kate, if they want to follow your work and what you do?
That's a good question. You can just email me at ACA, ACA, FEM, FEMME, fan, FAN, at gmail.com. Yep.
Yeah. And Kate, you're doing your postdoc is on your doctorate is on what exactly? Because
Yep. So my doctorate is
already said it, but
so my doctorate is I'm finishing up. I'm in the last stages of finishing up my thesis right now, which looks at women in science fiction fandom in the post-war era. The one chapter of my thesis was published in Foundation, the International Review of Science Fiction, that won the Peter Nichols Prize. I've also written on fan fiction for the Routledge Handbook of Star Trek. I served as an Arthur C. Clarke judge for the Arthur C. Clarke Award. And I mostly write about the history of science fiction and fandom. So that's my little soapbox academic spiel. You can email me or look me up on the interwebs.
Yeah, Kate, I when we get done recording, I have something I want to share with you on Star Trek fandom. But Alec, how do the folks find your work? Your most recent book was on Buckminster Fuller. That was an intense book. That had to take an insane amount of research. So how long did you work on that one, just out of curiosity?
I would say 3 years total, which is less time than it needed. It was quite insane to get that book out in 3 years. But I write full time. I don't have like a backup plan, so I kind of have to get through these things quickly. I don't have 10 years to work on a book like that, even though I would love that at some point. But yeah, people want to look me up. I'm currently taking a social media break, which is going great. But if they look me up online, you'll find my blog. It's one of the first results on Google, and there's a contact page there that people can use to email me, and I definitely welcome any contact like that whatsoever.
Yeah, and the book is Astounding. Definitely, if you found this episode interesting, you'll probably find that interesting as well. I'm David Agranoff. If you got this far, you probably listened to my whole series, but my latest book is The Last Night to Kill Nazis. And I do want to put a shout out there. I'm working on doing an event about science fiction research in Bloomington, Indiana, the day before my hometown, the day before the solar eclipse. So I'm also doing a book release party for my next science fiction novel called People's Park that takes place in Indiana. And so I'm suggesting to people, if you want to come to the release party for People's Park, it's in Bloomington the day before. We are one of the best places to watch the total solar eclipse in the country. So you can make a twofer trip. You can also nerd out. The Ray Bradbury Center is in Indianapolis, and they have recreated Ray Bradbury's office. All of his library is there in the center, and they use pictures to put it on the shelf exactly how he had it, which is not in any logical system, by the way. But the desk where he wrote almost all of his books is there, and the chair he sat in to write almost everything is there, and you can sit in it. And because I didn't know this, but Indianapolis, IUPUI was the home to one of the biggest Bradbury experts on the planet. And so we also have the Kurt Vonnegut Museum in Indiana. So what I'm suggesting is you do all these things and then watch a solar eclipse. I will obviously be there promoting my science fiction novel, People's Park. And that comes out, and that is April 7th and 8th. So folks, if you're interested, come find me there. But my book, The Last Night to Kill Nazis, is available nationwide at Barnes and Nobles, or it's supposed to be soon. But I'm asking people, if you do not see it on the shelf at Barnes and Nobles, ask them, because that helps me get it out there. And that's, if you hate Nazis but like vampires, it's a perfect book for you. The Last Night to Kill Nazis. So thank you, folks. Alec and Kate, thank you for joining me and talking about John W. Campbell's Twilight. Next up in the series is Helen O'Loy by Lester Del Rey, and our guests will be Robin Murphy of Robotics Through Science Fiction, Professor Lisa Yazik, and Brian Collins of Sci-Fi Remembrance. So that's going to be a pretty good panel. And I have a feeling Lisa Yazik is going to have a lot to say about the gender roles in that story. So she was very insistent that she wanted to be on that episode. Because I said, hey, are there any you want to be on? And she was very insistent on that one. So I have a feeling she has a lot to say. And I'm really looking forward to that one. And on that note, folks, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. I'm sure both Kate and Alec will be back in future episodes of this series. I would love to have Kate back for Judith Merrill's Only a Mother, and Alec told me you really want to be on Cold Equations, right?
Oh yes, that'll be a barn burner when we talk about the cold equation.
Yes. Oh, Kate, are you saying you're interested in that one too?
Yes, absolutely. Oh my gosh.
All right. Well, we might have a reunion then in a couple, probably 9 months or whatever we get there. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. That should be a good one. All right, folks. Thank you for joining us, and keep reading science fiction and keep the history alive. Thanks.